This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 16 through 19 in Seminar 3. In the last video, we considered the function of the primordial signifier, what happens when it goes missing, and ended with a question regarding the relationship between the primordial signifier and the symbolic father. We'll be taking up that last point today, trying as best as possible to clarify the connection at this stage of the seminars. We'll then consider the notion of metaphor and metonymy, which become very relevant in light of the role of the primordial signifier and our understanding of clinical structures. In Lecture 16, Lacan addresses the paternal function, which is realized in three manners. First, there's the symbolic realization of the father through imaginary conflict. This is an antagonistic relationship on the imaginary plane between the subject and the imaginary father that finds resolution in the eventual introjection of the image, whereby symbolic integration can finally take place. This marks the emergence of the so-called normal mind. Second, there's the imaginary realization of the father through symbolic conduct. This is exemplified in neurotic clinical structures, such as in Couvade, where a man undergoes a ritualistic act as if being physically affected by birth. Here, the signifier finds its way into the imaginary body and gives rise to its form as a symptom. Third, there is the father's real function of procreation in an imaginary form, providing a basis for a psychotic clinical structure. As seen with Schreber, there is the delusion of populating the world with men of a Schreberian spirit. Despite this adding some clarity regarding the configuration of the imaginary, symbolic, and real father in so-called normal, neurotic, and psychotic subjects, we remain at a loss for what exactly the function of the father is. Lacan provides a little more elaboration in Lecture 17. There he states that what is at stake is the fundamental question concerning the way truth enters the life of the subject. This fundamental question is mediated by the ultimate meaning of the idea of the father, Lacan states. This father belongs to sacred reality, meaning that nothing points to the father's function, presence, and dominance in lived experience. Instead, it becomes thinkable only as an ahistorical drama concerning the death and murder of the father. In this mythological unfolding, the image of the father gives way to the symbol of the father. But what is this symbol? Interestingly, Lacan says it shares the same genesis as the death instinct, that we are expressing one and the same thing. And yet we don't get much more clarity on this. But instead, this discussion of the symbolic father leads to a lengthy and in-depth consideration of language. Yet we must ask once again, what is the connection between the role of the father and the function of the primordial signifier? What accounts for the transition from this discussion of father to this discussion of language? In Lecture 19, a public talk delivered by Lacan, we get some clarification if one reads it with the question in mind. In the lecture, he reminds us that the unconscious is essentially speech, the speech of the other, and can only be recognized when the other sends it back to you. The compulsion to repeat is the insistence of this speech that, despite the resistance to it by the ego, returns in the subject until it has said its final word. As such, it's essential to understand that Lacan's anthropology is centered deeply around the idea that the human subject is possessed by and condemned to being the support of this final word. Okay, what is this final word? In the very next paragraph on page 243, he answers the question somewhat. It's the law by which the subject is possessed and punishes itself for the sake of a symbolic debt that the neurotic subject keeps paying off. Okay, so we've moved from the final word being connected to the law, which is seeking to be recognized through a repetitive insistence. And now we also understand the subject whose fundamental position begins in guilt. Relying on Freud, guilt originates for Lacan in the murder of the imaginary father. Lacan claims that a common string passing through all of Freud's works is the attempt to understand this mechanism that makes possible the taking hold of an entire system of signifiers through this one preeminent symbol of the dead father. Through this mechanism, the paternal function emerges whereby the law is imposed upon the subject and desire becomes regulated by intervening in the imaginary relation between mother and child. And so the function of the father is not to get rid of desire, but to unite it with the law in such a way that it can be structured and re-expressed in another form. And so long as one's symbolic order derives from a culture governed by patriarchy, this role must then be the father. If one remains confused by the gendered language here, it may help to keep in mind that whenever we speak of the symbolic father and its paternal function vis-a-vis the primordial signifier, what Lacan seems to mean here is the imposition of the law or a fundamental prohibition of the symbolic order that both alienates and also confers an identity upon the subject, meaning the subject is named and positioned relative to the authority of that law. This is in part what is meant by the name of the father, which in French there can be a play off of the words so that the name of the father sounds like the no of the father, highlighting the primordial prohibition that is contained within it. And so the law is the primordial prohibition against the complete satisfaction from the original object of desire, that being the imaginary mother. The law lifts desire out of its imaginary forms and structures it, allowing for an orderly transference of meanings whereby desire can be redirected in new forms thanks to the law's governing influence over the signifying chain. This now allows us to return to lectures 17 and 18 to address the relationship and differences between the signifier and the signified, as well as their connection to metaphor and metonymy. Lacan's deployment of these terms is highly influenced by Roman Jakobson's work, and for this reason I'll spend a little time here trying to describe Jakobson's distinct theory of language before considering how Lacan applies it to clinical structures. Jakobson, influenced in part by Saussure, claims language consists of constitutive elements, the most basic of which are phonemes, which are governed by rules that establish acceptable combinations, thereby then allowing for the formation of words that can form grammatical phrases. At each level, fewer and fewer restrictions are present, whereas there are relatively strict rules governing the acceptable phonemic combinations. The combination of phrases and sentences allows for almost an endless set of possibilities. From this analysis, Jakobson identifies two aspects of language, one based on contiguity, concerning the combination of constituent parts of language, regardless of their meaning. The other aspect concerns matters of similarity, whereby substitutions of signs can be understood in light of the comparative meanings between one sign and another. This allows Jakobson to reconceptualize aphasias as disorders of similarity and contiguity. In a similarity disorder, language comprehension remains intact so long as the discourse stays within a confined syntactic arrangement. The patient can understand who ate who in a sentence like, "The lion ate the deer," because it stays within the standard grammatical structure of the English language. A more pronounced difficulty for this class of aphasia is the ability to access a broad mental lexicon that the patient can draw from to communicate. Consequently, the patient has trouble getting words out and relies on overly broad, common words, thing, piece, this, that, etc. Or maybe a broad functional phrase for a tool like that sharp thingy for knife. In other words, the patient has difficulty substituting these common words for similar but more precise words. The patient knows what a knife is, but cannot access that word and instead is left with a more concrete description of the sharp thingy. Jacobson calls this lost capacity of naming a loss of metalanguage. That is a loss in the linguistic capacity to reflect upon language. This reflexivity of language makes possible sign substitutions. Instead, the patient is bound to a relation of contiguity. In other words, it's not that the patient is incapable of any substitutions, but the words have to be, in a sense, next to or touching one another in a rather literal sense. So when asked to list the name of animals, they may be listing them in the order in which they were observed in a zoo, rather than accessing a broad network of semantically related terms organized by this category of animals. In a contiguity disorder, by contrast, there is no lost access to words themselves. Instead, the impairment pertains to a loss in the ability to combine simpler linguistic elements into more complex units, diminishing the extent and variety of sentences. The syntactical rules are lost, resulting in sentences characterized by Jacobson as a mere word heap. Here, word order becomes chaotic as grammatical terms such as prepositions, articles, conjunctions go missing. So the patient becomes confined to substitutions based on similarity, but without the necessary structuring that makes that communication understandable to another. Jacobson concludes that the varieties of aphasia lie between these two types, one involving impairments in selection and substitution, a similarity disorder, the other involving impairment in combination and interweaving, a contiguity disorder. This distinction among types corresponds to the linguistic acts of metaphor and metonymy, respectively. Notably, Jacobson links each act to different literary styles, and maybe these examples will help us get a grasp of what metaphor and metonymy are. So, for example, in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, the artistic attention is placed on the main character's little red handbag when she's committing suicide. This is a metonymic digression from the plot to the contiguous surroundings. This is unlike when, for example, Shakespeare pens the words, "It is the east and Juliet is the sun." This is a metaphor where there is a transition of words and meanings based on similarity rather than contiguity. It's important to note that in metonymy, we begin to touch upon reality itself. This will become important as we consider how Lacan applies this distinction to clinical structures. This distinction between metaphor and metonymy is fundamental, drawing attention to the mechanisms of neurosis, marginalized phenomena of normal life, and dreams. Indeed, Freud's notion of condensation is equated to metaphor, while his notion of displacement is identified with metonymy. Lacan reinforces a lot of what Jacobson has already said. So, metaphor is marked by substitution, that is, a transference of meaning from one word to another. Lacan calls metaphor a transference of signifiers. But the meaning-to-meaning transfer is made possible only because of a syntax, a primordial order of the signifier, which facilitates it. While there is a transfer of one meaning to another, the syntactical or grammatical rules remain the same. In other words, the metaphor is placed in the position of the subject in which a substitution may occur, but without alteration to the general structure that continues to position the new meaning in that same grammatical position. Metonymy and metaphor occur on different levels, with metonymy residing at an earlier, more fundamental level. It's why metaphor is often lost on children until they have incorporated the grammatical rules of the language. A child needs to acquire these fundamental grammatical rules before being able to appreciate a metaphorical transfer. Deficits of a metaphorical kind entail a dissolution between intentional meaning and the apparatus of signifiers, whereas deficits of a metonymical kind entail dissociating the link internal to the signifiers themselves. These deficits correspond to different clinical structures, which Lacan only briefly begins to address here. Specifically, Lacan finds a parallel between the contiguity deficits of certain aphasics and what characterizes the psychotic's relation to language. He's clear and repeats himself a few times to indicate that in no way is aphasia the same as psychosis. Nonetheless, there's some similarity here regarding the coordination of signifiers. One can observe this contiguity disorder in interrupted speech as it becomes libidinized, that is, invested with libido. The phenomenon of contiguity then imposes itself upon the subject, being experienced as an invasion, a psychical intrusion by the signifier from the real. In the next video, we'll consider the concept of the quilting point, what role it plays in maintaining a relationship between the chain of signifiers and signifieds. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.